from Washington, D.C., this is Balance of Power with Joe Mathieu.
President Trump could end the war in Ukraine just as he starts one in Venezuela. Welcome to the Monday edition as the Secretary of State makes revisions to the Ukraine peace plan and the chairman of the Joint Chiefs makes a beeline for the Caribbean. We're going to get the latest on all of this from Jeanne Welch at Bloomberg Economics as we now get details, the first batch of details from President Trump's call with President Xi of China from earlier today. We'll have analysis from our political panel, and we'll talk as well with Republican Congressman Fleischmann of Tennessee. With 6 weeks until Obamacare subsidies expire. It's all after we take a look at Wall Street. We'll start there right now with Amy Morris in Washington and her view of the markets. Amy, how's it going?
It's going green, Joe. The Bureau of Economic Analysis says the advanced estimate of third quarter GDP has been canceled. The figures were originally scheduled to be released October 30th. Those were delayed by the federal government shutdown. The September income and spending report, which includes the Federal Reserve's preferred inflation gauge, will be released December 5th. We're going to keep an eye on all of that for you as we check markets for you all day long here at Bloomberg. The S&P 500 up 1.6%. NASDAQ up 2.6%. The Dow up about 0.6%. The 10-year Treasury yield at 4.04%. The 2-year yield at 3.5%. Those stocks keep rising as we launch into this holiday-shortened trading week. Hopes are building that the Fed will cut rates at its next meeting in December. Fed Governor Christopher Waller told Fox Business he's advocating an interest rate cut in December, but after that, he says he expects a more meeting-by-meeting approach. Bitcoin began the week by continuing a prolonged sell-off, putting it on the path for the worst month it's had since 2022. The wider crypto market now in a pronounced slump despite surging institutional adoption and a series of policy wins. Bitcoin is now just a little bit higher, about 0.5% higher after being in the red all day long, still around $88,000. High turkey prices and low production creating a shortage of turkeys for food banks across the country. Turkey costs have soared, contributing to shortages, straining the budgets and inventories of charitable organizations. Now, the Department of Agriculture estimates turkey production at its lowest levels in 40 years. Wholesale prices forecast at about $1.35 a pound. Compare that with last year, it was just 94 cents a pound. For on-demand news 24 hours a day, subscribe to Bloomberg News Now wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Amy Morris. That's a Bloomberg Business Flash. Let's go back to Balance of Power with Joe Mathieu.
Amy, thank you so much. Amy Morris will have more on the markets in just about 20 minutes' time as we keep the bead on Wall Street here, even as we talk politics in Washington with the breaker from the White House, the president himself on Truth Social, not only confirming the call earlier today with President Xi, but also at least putting his own stamp on what happened, calling it a very good telephone call with President Xi of China, one that included many topics, he says, including Ukraine, Russia, fentanyl, soybeans, and other farm products. He talked about their successful meeting in South Korea of a couple of weeks ago and made clear that he will be going to China. President Trump says he's accepted an invitation to visit Beijing in April, after which he reciprocated that President Xi will be a guest for a state visit here in the U.S. later on this year. There are questions, though, about what else was discussed, because China's version of that call is quite different than what President Trump mentioned here. And there is, of course, room for all of these to be true. But we've had a number of breaking stories over the past half hour or so, with the Associated Press first reporting that a judge has dismissed cases against James Comey and Letitia James after finding that the prosecutor was illegally appointed. We're also tracking, of course, the latest on a Ukraine peace plan, a 28-point plan we discussed last week has now apparently been whittled down to below 20 points, with revisions coming from the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, to help favor Ukraine in the hopes of ending the war with Russia, maybe even by Thanksgiving of this week. We'll find out as we make our way through the next couple of days. But we start with what we know, and a conversation with Jeanne Welch from Bloomberg Economics. Our chief geoeconomics analyst is with us in Washington. And Jeanne, it's great to see you. China had some other ideas that it said came up on this call, namely Taiwan. When the president describes this as productive and very good, how do we think the Chinese are describing it?
It sounds from Beijing's readout to the call that they framed it in positive terms, that they felt that President Xi gave them respect on the matter, essentially recognizing that Taiwan is an issue that matters a lot to Beijing and one that is not to be trifled with, is I think how Beijing would frame that call. Now, what I think when they say Taiwan, what they're really referring to is this ongoing feud with Tokyo over statements that the prime minister there made about Taiwan soon after coming to power. And my bet is that this call was really about Beijing saying to Washington, let this play out. Don't get involved. Don't get behind your ally on this. Just let us play this out.
The anatomy of a phone call between two world leaders like this can be complex. We don't assume that President Xi just picked up the phone, or do we, knowing that there would typically be days of preparations and a drumbeat in the media leading up to that meeting?
Well, normally when things like this come together, it takes some advanced scheduling.
Yeah.
These are two leaders, obviously, with pretty busy agendas, so you have to work that out. You have to work out the time difference. So I'm sure there was something that had to be put in the works a few days ago, but this doesn't look like a planned call. This wasn't, for example, a planned check-in on status after the Busan meeting on how things are going with implementing the trade deal. This seems to be something that came out more organically, I think, in response to this ongoing feud between Beijing and Tokyo and statements that U.S. representatives in the region made recently in support of Tokyo that might have led Beijing to think, let's say something preemptively now before Washington gets involved any further.
Really interesting. I want to ask you about one of the issues that they reportedly discussed on this call, which is Russia and Ukraine. You heard me mention the peace plan that is, as Marco Rubio describes, a living, breathing document, and it's one that's still being changed. The Secretary of State talked about this as he showed up in Geneva over the weekend for meetings with Ukrainian officials. Listen.
It is probably the most productive day we have had on this issue, maybe in the entirety of our engagement, but certainly in a very long time. But work remains, and because this continues to be a working process, you know, I don't want to declare victory or finality.
U.S. officials say the draft agreement has been revised, but we don't know exactly what has come out or what has gone in, suggesting that the Secretary of State is doing something at least more favorable for Ukraine, which had a non-starter reaction when it saw this draft that included input from Russia, apparently not from Kyiv. What do we think is changing?
Yeah, not just input. It sounds like it was co-drafted with Russia, and you can see that in some of the terms, like limiting the size of Ukraine's military. That's no-go for Kyiv. Forcing Ukraine to turn over territories that Russia doesn't currently control. That's another no-go. It's already hard for Ukraine to potentially accept the idea of ceding over territories that Russia does currently occupy, and I think that continues to be a real sticking point in these negotiations. But ultimately, I think we've seen this movie before. Washington talks to Moscow, comes out with a set of terms that Moscow agrees with, and the U.S. wanting to get peace finally done brings them to Ukraine. Ukraine and the Europeans push back. We come up with a new deal that Moscow won't accept, and the war just continues to grind on.
Wow.
So my prediction here is not a incredibly optimistic one, and that I don't think we're likely to see a peace deal come out of it. But I do think whatever we do get is likely to be more favorable to Ukraine. And so there's a crisis averted that they're not going to be pushed into an unfavorable deal.
Doesn't sound like you see this ending by Thanksgiving, though.
Not the war, for sure. Maybe the negotiations, because I think Moscow will very quickly say no.
What do you make of, before you leave us, the three voices the president's hearing from on this, at least in the most recent throes of negotiations? Steve Witkoff, Jared Kushner, his son-in-law, and Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, who's being framed in the media as the angel on his shoulder, and I'm not sure what the other two are, Jenny.
I think this is what you might refer to as kind of a process foul, where there have been people having negotiations with Moscow and maybe not a full principles or cabinet level alignment on the ultimate peace plan that would be produced and negotiated out of that. And what we see here is sort of Rubio getting back involved, not only as Secretary of State, but also the National Security Advisor, and trying to structure this process a little bit more. But this is not atypical for this administration or the Trump team in general. It's something we saw a lot in the first term, and I think it's something we're likely to continue to see on this and other issues.
It's really great to talk this out with you, Jenny. Thank you so much. Jennifer Welch, Bloomberg Economics, our chief geo-economist, with us here on Balance of Power. I'm Joe Mathieu in Washington with another breaker. It's just been one after the other today on this Monday in the Capitol. The White House now set to delay the health care proposal that we were told to anticipate. That's coming from I guess what we now call MS Now, the old MSNBC, which was ahead on this story about a 2-year extension with limitations when it comes to Obamacare subsidies, not a full repeal and replace as we've seen in the past. This would allow the government from shutting down, presumably at the end of January, and would have 2 years on the clock here, get through the midterms and give lawmakers an opportunity to negotiate things. Apparently now, that's not going to be the case, and it's a good opportunity to bring in Chuck Fleischmann, the Republican congressman from Tennessee, is back with us today on Bloomberg TV and radio. It's good to see you, Congressman. You're on the Appropriations Committee, and you've got your eyes, obviously, on the future health care negotiations that were promised coming out of the government shutdown. Does this make you worry that another shutdown may be around the corner?
No, not at all. The original shutdown, and thank you, Joe, for talking about me being on appropriations. I'm actually a chairman on appropriations. I chair the Energy and Water Subcommittee, so I have been involved in the appropriations process very, very closely, and that's why I was so disheartened by the Democratic shutdown over this tangential issue, the healthcare subsidies, that has nothing to do with the appropriations process. And since the Democrats caved on that because they couldn't stand on that, they're going to have to try to find another issue. They lost the shutdown because they hurt the American people. I'm going to focus on either before January 30th or by January 30th, us conferencing the remaining 9 bills. We've done 3 that are passed into law: Milk on VA, Ag Approps, and Legislative Branch Approps. To our credit, that is done. We've got 9 more to go. I'm an optimist. I think we will get it done. I do think the Democrats hurt themselves on the ACA issues with the subsidies by bringing that in extraneously to a process that had nothing to do with it. They were making more progress before this. They hurt themselves with a lot of folks, particularly on the right.
Well, I know that you see it that way, Congressman, but we're 6 weeks out from Obamacare subsidies expiring, and you've got John Thune promising next door a vote on this. And I know there are even some Republican members, I won't say the name Marjorie Taylor Greene out loud, but some Republican members who've actually made quite a fuss about rising premiums. At some point, something needs to be done, right? You either extend this or you replace it with something. What do you think it should be?
Well, bear this in mind. These were COVID era policies that were actually put in place. So this is not from the original Affordable Care Act, from the original Obamacare. And I would agree, we need as a nation to have comprehensive health care reform. But this just shows the Achilles heel of Obamacare, of the frailties. It was doomed from the inception. Many parts of it had fallen apart. It's not been what it was promised to be by President Obama and the Democrats back then. We need, as Americans, Republicans and Democrats, senators, members of the House, to really look at where we can actually fix the health care situation. The left has gone crazy. They want Medicare for all. They want these subsidies. But again, this was a non-issue. This was totally outside the process. Everybody in the Beltway knew this. That's why when the Democrats caved in, they had nothing to stand on. That's why so many in their base are upset. As for Ms. Greene, I respect her opinions and the like. As you see, she's going to be leaving the House, vacating her seat. She's my neighbor right to the south, right across the Georgia line. She's in my media market. I wish her well, and we look forward to the next special election, which a Republican will win with ease in March.
I suspect that that's true based on the makeup of that district. The White House plan that's just been delayed, Congressman, apparently includes a 2-year extension of the Obamacare subsidies and new limits on eligibility. There'd be some, for instance, income caps for enrollees to qualify for ACA tax credits, as well as minimum premium payments. Is that something that you could get your arms around to keep premiums from rising?
I want to look at what comes out. Excellent question. Yeah. I was willing all along to discuss this issue. If you recall, when the Democrats shut the government down, and finally now they admit they did, for whatever reason, they say over these subsidies, They hurt people on SNAP. They hurt women, infants, and children. They hurt poor people. They hurt working people. They hurt the country. The issue of these subsidies is an important issue, but as you recall, I think we need to look at the overall system for reforms. As I understand these subsidies as they exist now, they're giving it to people who are sometimes 400 times the poverty level. So if we're going to help people, let's help people who are truly needy and not those who are not in need just for some hypothetical political win for the Democrats. But I still go back to the fact Democrats hurt themselves on a tangible issue that was outside the appropriation process. If they'd have continued to negotiate with our speaker, with Republicans, you would have found a lot of Republicans coming to the table to talk about that issue, but in its proper lane, outside the appropriation process, where it's always been.
Well, I'll tell you what, when everybody comes back at some point, there's going to need to be a funding mechanism. And as the appropriations man yourself, you just ticked through some of these spending bills. Do we really believe that you can get 12 spending bills passed and a government funded before January 30, or do we need another CR in there somewhere? Because whether it's now, January 30, February 30, it would be the first time in a generation, I think, that happened, Congressman.
Well, Joe, you raise an excellent point. Let me take it backwards and forwards. We do not need a government shutdown. It is always wrong to shut the government down. That's why I'm still furious with Chuck Schumer for this blatant lie, this myth that he perpetrated on the American people. Everybody in Washington, D.C., Democrats and Republicans, knew it was wrong. They did it for whatever reason. So we need to keep it open. Now, the best way to keep it open is with a budget. Of the 12 bills, we've got 3 of the bills done. So we've got 9 left. The reality is, I think we can probably get another 6 done, maybe 7, and then those balance of bills that perhaps are going to be harder to conference. I'll be specific. State and foreign ops, homeland security, those are harder bills. My bill, the energy and water bill, is a very non-controversial bill, tremendous bipartisan and bicameral support. The Senate is supposed to have their version out today. My version has been out and actually passed in the House for months. What I think we'll do is pass maybe 7 of the 12, maybe 8 of the 12, and then the balance of those bills work on a CR. So some type of what we call in D.C. a cromnibus. Part continuing resolution on those few bills we can't, but let's try to go for all 12 and see how many we can do. We've got 3 down, 9 to go. I'm hopeful for more.
All right. Fantastic. I need to ask you about the election that is looming, a special in your state of Tennessee, December 2nd, to fill former Representative Mark Green's seat. Democrats are putting a lot of money into this, and you might have seen some writing at Punchbowl this morning. They're crunching numbers here. In a world in which Democrats flip that seat and get a couple of others here, keep Mikey Sherrill's seat in New Jersey, not to mention the one in Houston, the late Representative Sylvester Turner's seat.
Correct.
Republicans could have something like a 2-seat margin if this does not go your way. Will Tennessee, in our remaining moment, keep that from happening?
Yes, you're absolutely right. Looking at that, Chad Pergram had a very good article on the entire situation today. Punchbowl did as well. Let me explain pretty much where this is. You're absolutely right. That
it's got to be quick, though. Sorry, sir.
Sir?
Just got to be quick. Sorry, only about 30 seconds.
The Dems will win in Houston. Van Ips will win in Tennessee, maybe not by 20 points. He'll beat Afton Bain with ease. The New Jersey seat will be Democratic, and the Marjorie Taylor Greene will be Republican. We'll be up by probably 2 to 4 narrow margins, but we can govern with narrow margins.
Political analysis from Chuck Fleischmann. I love this. The Republican congressman from Tennessee with his take. Thank you, Congressman. As always, we never even got to nuclear. It's a Monday in Washington. Thanks for being with us on Bloomberg. As we connect the dots between Washington and Wall Street, a pretty nice way to start the week. It was looking a little shaky last week with our eyes on the chip stocks that are bouncing back nicely today. And, of course, even crypto moving modestly higher here. There's breaking news at the White House. If you were just with us, you heard us break the headline about the health care plan. Will health care be the new infrastructure in the second Trump term? Health Care Week. This was supposed to be it, with a proposal due as early as today. on a way to handle the expiration of Obamacare subsidies, the topic that led to the longest government shutdown in history, which Congressman Chuck Fleischmann was just talking with us about. He still thinks it was unjust, but here we are. President Trump reportedly set to unveil details of the long-awaited proposal. Remember, concepts of a plan? In this case, a 2-year extension of Obamacare subsidies, COVID-era subsidies, along with new limits on eligibility, income caps for enrollees, minimum premium payments, dubbed the Healthcare Price Cuts Act. Rolled out as soon as today, according to morning reports. The president was going to have an announcement alongside Dr. Oz. And now MS Now, as we call the old MSNBC, which was among the first to report these details, is reporting that the announcement has been postponed with no new date in sight. This becomes a problem knowing that government funding expires on January 30th, and Democrats, at least in the Senate, are banking on a promised vote by John Thune over something. Republicans have been waiting for the president to step in. So we're kind of back to square one. And that's one thing that we're going to be talking about coming up in a moment here. Let's get into it with our panel. Jeanne, Zaino, and Lanhee. Chen are with us, Bloomberg politics contributor. Jeanne, Zaino is Democracy Visiting Fellow at Harvard Kennedy School's Ash Center. Lanhee is our Republican Strategist Fellow in American Public Policy Studies at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University. Jeanne, I'll get back to where I started. Is this going to be the new infrastructure week? Because a lot of people have been waiting for a plan, not only from Donald Trump, but from the Republican Party, knowing that the ACA was passed, 15 years ago?
Yeah, Joe, God help us all if we have to go through this again. But the reality is there are so many criticisms from all sides of the Republican Party on what is being proposed, which means that nothing has changed in 15 years. This has been a conundrum for Republicans all along, and it continues to be. And you just look at some of the political reality of this. Can you really spend 15 years fighting Obamacare and then swoop in at the last minute after a bad election and a government shutdown and say, hey, you know what, we're going to prop this thing up, and you all on the right just going to have to swallow that because we need to get through the midterm? That's horrible politics to start with. And of course, you have then other criticisms of this, like where are the details about giving people money? How do you cut costs if this is your plan? Very little of this has been talked about. So they went out too early in this trial balloon of an idea without much of the specifics and a lot of pushback politically. So I don't see in this narrow House with Republicans so narrowly controlling it how they could get this passed now. I'm not even sure they can do it in the next few weeks.
Well, it seems conservatives on Capitol Hill are upset about this or pushed back on it, to Jeannie's point. Lanhee, a number interested in how the plan would impact abortion coverage. They were blindsided at not being consulted to begin with. But you see the details here. Healthcare Price Cuts Act, right down to limiting subsidies to individuals with income up to 700% of the federal poverty line. If the White House had actually included lawmakers on this and given them a heads up, would we be seeing a plan unveiled today? What went wrong?
Well, I think some of the challenge goes to this fundamental issue that, Republicans have never voted for really any part of the Affordable Care Act or any of the subsequent expansions. So putting in front of them the idea that they would vote for enhanced subsidies, even with an income cap, even with a very good provision to potentially direct some of the excess from a downgrade in plan into a health savings account. I think those are ideas that Republicans would broadly support. I think the challenge is putting Republicans on record with respect to voting for a piece of the Affordable Care Act. By the way, a piece of the Affordable Care Act that's not even working all that well by all accounts. So I think that is part of the challenge. The other issue you have, of course, is that there's a whole suite of other ideas Republicans have talked about to enhance the supply of health care, to help lower costs, improve quality. And those ideas are nowhere to be found in this proposal that the White House has put forward. So I think they are going to have to go back to the drawing board and figure out what provisions are acceptable to congressional Republicans, where there is potentially common ground. And then let's not forget, this is a political issue as well, Joe, going into the midterm elections. Republicans do feel some pressure, I think, to put forward an idea, or at least to have their members on record in favor of an idea that can be used to push back against Democrat claims that they have no ideas on health care. So there's all sorts of different dynamics at play here, but the idea that this was going to get all the way through the process and Republicans were all going to be on board today, I think that was pretty ambitious.
So what's Democrats' posture here, or Democrats' expectation, Jeanne, knowing that this is why we shut down? There's a massive expectation for a vote in the Senate if it goes well, or if there's at least some critical mass. I guess there'll be a vote in the House. Or are you just circling January 30 on your calendar for the next shutdown?
We have it on all our calendars, Joe, and it could very well happen, unfortunately. You know, I think Democrats have to own some of the mess that we are in with this. If you are committed to the Obamacare Act and these subsidies, then why do you sunset them after 5 years? They should have made them permanent. They should have done that and been honest with the American people about the cost. So I don't think that Democrats are on the, winning side of this from a policy perspective. What Democrats feel, however, is they are on the winning side of this politically, and that matters to them an awful lot. The president and Republicans, some of their lowest numbers are on health care, and specifically health care costs. This is almost like the Republicans' version of immigration and crime. It's bad for Republicans. And what the president is trying to do is what he has done consistently with this White House, which is force Republicans to swallow something that is in his interest, but not necessarily in theirs. Because again, when you spend almost 2 decades fighting against Obamacare, are you really going to, in 24, 48, 72 hours, be able to convince Republicans, hey, just go along with it, just extend this thing so we can get through the midterm and the shutdown? That's not going to fly. And I think part of what we're seeing here is part of what we heard after Marjorie Taylor Greene resigned or announced her resignation on Friday, which is some Republicans in Congress feel that they are being run around by this White House and by leadership, and they aren't going to take it on something this sensitive to their base.
Well, this isn't getting any easier, and a great panel to talk about it. Jeanne, thank you. Jeanne Zaino, Lanhee Chen, our Democratic analyst, Bloomberg politics contributor, and Republican strategist. Thank you both for the insights today and a great conversation here on Balance of Power. I go back to the post on Truth Social from Donald Trump on the 20th of September. It was 6:44 p.m., a Sunday, I believe, right? Pam, I have reviewed over 30 statements and posts saying that essentially same old story as last time. All talk, no action, nothing being done. What about Comey, Adam Shifty Schiff, Letitia? 3 exclamation points. We can now answer 2 of them, at least, as a federal judge today throws out criminal charges. They threw out the case against former FBI Director James Comey and New York Attorney General Letitia James, ruling the prosecutor brought the cases had been illegally appointed. In the clutch right now, June Grasso, the host of Bloomberg Law on Bloomberg Radio, is with us from World Headquarters in New York. June, that was fast. What do you make of this?
It was fast, but it was sort of expected because judges across the country have come to the same conclusion in other cases involving Trump-appointed U.S. attorneys. It's about the Appointments Clause, and it's about Section 546, where once a U.S. attorney is appointed as an interim U.S. attorney, they have 120 days to serve. At the end of that time, a panel of judges, if the Senate hasn't confirmed them, a panel of judges then would pick the next U.S. attorney. And what happened in this case was that 120 days ran. Eric Siebert, who was the interim U.S. attorney, was then appointed by the panel of judges, and then Pam Bondi, President Trump, decided to fire him, or did he leave? It's still not clear, and put in Lindsay Halligan, someone who, as the judge notes in her first sentence, a White House aide with no prior prosecutorial experience. And the judge here ruled, and by the way, there are 3 judges handling these cases, 2 judges and a magistrate judge. So this is a judge in South Carolina who's handling just the appointment of Lindsay Halligan. She said that's not a lawful appointment, sorry, and we have to dismiss the cases without prejudice so they can be brought again. But wow, would it be, it's a nightmare to bring these cases again for various reasons, which, if you want to know, I'll tell you. But it's
well, I can't even imagine. But I am curious. So this was without prejudice. Would prosecutors have to create a whole new indictment, or do they just find another court to refile the case?
Well, I don't think they can refile these cases in any other district, because you have where Comey testified and where Letitia James.
Understood.
So then you have the problem. So if they decided to, they'd have to go to another grand jury, bring it again. But if they decided that, so who would bring that? Because the judge just said you can't bring another U.S. attorney in here because the 120 days has expired. So unless they get a Senate-confirmed U.S. attorney, who is going to bring that case? That's one issue. Comey, there's also an issue of statute of limitations, possibly, because the statute of limitations was running, and that's why Lindsay Halligan ran into the grand jury with no one else with her and brought this. So there is a statute that you could, if there's a procedural defect, you can bring it within 6 months. You could bring it again. But is this a procedural defect or not? That's why I'm saying it's not going to be just, we're going to go to another grand jury and re-indict. Sure. No, it's going to be much tougher.
Wow. All right, 6 p.m. Eastern. You're my ride home, June. I listen to you every weekday, 6 p.m. on Bloomberg Law. June's going to have a great conversation on this one. It looks like Letitia James Comey on the loose. The Secretary of State describes the peace plan for Ukraine as a living, breathing document. Every day with input, he says, it changes. And that, of course, was the story over the course of the weekend. The Secretary of State dispatched to Geneva to meet with Ukrainian officials about this peace plan that is still evolving. In fact, revisions were made following the secretary's meeting with Ukraine to make this more favorable, more palatable to Kyiv. In a week, of course, President Trump said he wanted this done, putting forth a Thanksgiving deadline. The Secretary of State walking that back a bit as well, saying the deadline is that we want to get this done as soon as possible. We'd love it to be Thursday. The important point today is that we have made substantial progress. Progress was the word that came out of this meeting, with questions remaining about the source of this 28-point plan. Was it in fact drafted with the help of the Russians? In a tweet on Sunday, the Prime Minister of Poland, Donald Tusk, brought this to the fore, saying that he and other leaders are ready to negotiate. Quote, however, before we start our work, he wrote, it would be good to know for sure who is the author of the plan and where it was created, unquote. Much of this rides on security guarantees, whether Ukraine must give up territory or not, and we still need to see exactly where this plan stands now following the revisions. The security guarantees by the U.S. and by our European allies will be key to anything moving forward here, with the White House invoking, at least privately, something along the lines of an Article 5 violation if Ukraine were attacked. It's not just the Poles who are weighing in here, the Lithuanians as well. Speaking with Bloomberg's Oliver Crook this morning, Lithuania's foreign minister, Kęstutis Butrius, speaking about the prospect of a security guarantee. Let's listen together.
We cannot build our security on the hope that Russia will keep the promises. They never did, and they do not respect the international law. But they should, in the upcoming 5, 10, or 20 years. They won't. So that's why we need a credible working deterrence system, and that it is building the European security with Ukraine. And it's for us to decide how we will do it. It's not for the others, and especially not for Russia.
Especially not for Russia, he says, even though Russian fingerprints are all over this peace plan. It's where we start our conversation with Angela Stent, senior fellow at AEI and author of Putin's World, Russia Against the West and With the Rest. Angela, it's great to see you. Thank you for joining us. Could these revisions be made enough that Ukraine, in fact, accepts this peace plan?
Well, there's a lot of noise and confusion about all of this, but I think Ukraine, there are several red lines. It's not going to give up territory to Russia that Russia doesn't control. And that's why, when you read the draft of the treaty, some of it was clearly drafted in Moscow. We can argue about how much was. And then that it will never be able to join NATO. That's really up to NATO, as the Europeans have pointed out, not to Russia or really to the United States. It has to reduce the size of its armed forces, which are about 900,000 now, to 600,000. And I'm sure there's some bargaining room there. And the European plan, the counter plan to the US-Russian one, says that this is something that can be discussed. Know that there would be amnesty for everyone in this war. Again, from the Ukrainian point of view, the devastation that Russia has caused, the loss of life, the terror, the assassinations. Putin, anyway, has been declared a war criminal by the International Criminal Court. So there are a number of red lines, I think, here for Ukraine. But clearly, this is a bargaining process that's going on. It's obviously not going to be completed by Thanksgiving. And one of the questions for me is Russia going to drag this out now and say it's interested in a serious negotiation so that it can continue to make some advances along the battle lines in the hope that next year Ukraine will be in a weaker position than it is now?
Well, that would be right out of the Putin playbook. What do you think, Angela, about the individuals who have brought us to this point? We, of course, know Steve Witkoff has been deeply involved. Apparently, Jared Kushner, the president's son-in-law, as well. But then to see the Secretary of State come in with changes in Geneva, are they all on the same page or not?
Well, clearly this was drafted by Kirill Dmitriev, who's the head of the Sovereign Wealth Fund in Russia, and Stephen Witkoff. Dmitriev came to the United States. We made an exemption to grant him a visa, even though he's actually not supposed to get one. And he met in Miami with Mr. Witkoff, apparently with Jared Kushner, and they drafted this. But, as far as we can see, Secretary Rubio was not involved in that drafting. And there was this curious thing over the weekend where he had a call with a bipartisan group of senators at the Halifax International Security Forum in Canada, saying that he hadn't seen this before, that this came from Russia and this wasn't an American plan. Then he reversed himself a couple of hours later and said it was an American plan. He was there yesterday in Geneva. But I think the impression one gets is of lack of coordination within the administration about this agreement and who really wrote it.
Not so much on the same page. Angela Stent, I saw you in the New York Times yesterday. Seven experts on how to actually end the war in Ukraine, and you brought your prescription, which is fascinating to read here. Sanctions are not enough, you say. Ukraine needs to be able to purchase more weapons to convince Putin he will not win on the battlefield. And you go along to say, even if the Europeans were able to provide a stabilization force, without U.S. backup, that force would be constrained in what it can do. So what is the credible security guarantee in your eyes?
So a credible security guarantee would be, if the U.S. is serious about it, an Article 5 type guarantee. But that, of course, begs the question, well, if you're going to give it the same guarantee that you give NATO, why not admit Ukraine to NATO? But obviously that's off the cards at the moment. But it would have to be credible. And the way we don't know how this is being formulated from the U.S. side in this current peace agreement. But, previous guarantees didn't work. We all signed a memorandum in 1994 when Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons to come to its assistance if it were again invaded, and nobody did. So I think you really have to have a guarantee where you can really believe that the U.S. would back up its European allies, and if Russia were to reinvade, would use military force to get Russia to go back into Russia and leave Ukraine.
Mm-hmm. What do you make of the language from the Secretary of State that now this must be seen, the revisions must be seen and reviewed by Moscow? I think the line was that, of course, Russia gets a vote. Why are we so careful in dealing with the invading country in this case?
Because we have a president who really wants to improve ties to Russia, wants to reset relations with Russia, wants this war to end. He believes it wouldn't have started had he been president in 2022, and wants to get on with business deals with Russia, with maybe another nuclear arms control agreement with Russia. And this is, I think, why we're taking Russia into account. But we're treating the aggressor somehow better than we're treating the victim.
You've got the Army Secretary in Kyiv. Why is Dan Driscoll part of this, but the Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth, is nowhere to be found?
Well, here we get into maybe the internal politics of what's happening in this administration. Apparently, General Driscoll is quite close to the Vice President, J.D. Vance, who is advancing his potential candidacy, maybe to be the next Secretary of War. That's one explanation for it.
Okay, interesting. So what are the odds that President Trump and Vladimir Putin get together with Viktor Orban in Hungary for a summit? If they hammer out a peace plan here that Moscow feels is acceptable, is that the next step?
I think that would have been one of them. I think what we now have to see is, as the Secretary of State said, this is a living document. They're still making revisions to it. If they believe that this is the best offer they can make, and if the Russians are willing to sign on, because the Russians will have to make some compromises too, which has to do with the use of their frozen assets, then I think we could see a summit in Budapest. I wouldn't want to give a timetable to it, but that's a possibility.
Wow. We could see, I guess, President Zelensky here in Washington first. The reporting is he could make a visit as soon as this week if this comes together. Is that a smart move for him now, Angela? It seems to be, 1 out of 4 visits go pretty well for him at the White House. He found himself on the other side of the cabinet room table last time he was here, with reporters crowding behind him, and didn't exactly get the treatment that Viktor Orban got. Why come to Washington?
Because, I mean, Ukraine really doesn't want to lose what is left of U.S. support, and we're not really giving them financial support anymore, but we're still allowing Europeans to buy weapons from us that they then give to Ukraine. It's called the Pearl program. He wants that, and he doesn't. I don't think he wants to antagonize President Trump any further. But, the last time we were here, he was there. As you said, he was asked tough questions. But on the other hand, you can see the photos of the two leaders, the two presidents, smiling. And then we have this complete reversal from President Trump tweeting out yesterday that Ukraine was ungrateful, using really the same words that he used during that disastrous Oval Office meeting in February. So if Zelensky did come here, it would be really to reinforce the fact that Ukraine is willing to sign a peace deal, to have an immediate ceasefire along the current lines of contact, in other words, not ceding territory to Russia that Russia doesn't control. And that's why he would come here. But I'm not sure that it would be that advisable at the moment. I'm sure that he would wait and see how this now plays out with the meeting yesterday between the United States, Ukraine, and then there were some Europeans there. And then there's also a European plan, which Secretary Rubio says that he hasn't read yet, but maybe taking some of that into account too.
Yeah, it does seem interesting how we always get back to square one on the rhetoric here. It looks like the gears are turning once again on Russia sanctions on Capitol Hill, Angela Stent. In our remaining moment or so, I wonder if you see that hastening the acceptance of a peace plan. Is that motivating Donald Trump or Vladimir Putin?
So I'm afraid you just cut out. I didn't hear your question.
The prospect of sanctions in our remaining moment, will that hasten a peace deal?
Yeah. I mean, that's the intention of it, certainly to put more pressure on the Russians. There is that, Senate bill that could be signed any moment, and President Trump could sign it too. That's to get the Russians to seriously sit at the table. I don't know how effective that will be, but that's certainly the intent of it.
Well, we'll see if it goes anywhere. Angela, thank you for joining us. It's been some time since we had a chance to speak with Angela Stent. The book is Putin's World, Russia Against the West. And with the rest, senior fellow at AEI. We'll keep tabs on this story that could develop again today with the Secretary of State back in the United States following his trip to Geneva and revisions that are actively being made to the peace plan. Breaking news as well. James Comey, Letitia James, charges dropped. The indictments have been thrown out against both of them in a story that we're still getting our heads around here, following President Trump's decision to pursue indictments against both through his Department of Justice. We'll have more on the late edition on Bloomberg.